For decades, Russia's dictators publicly condemned capitalism. But when nobody was looking, behind closed doors, they built a vast, invisible empire. And this empire was so massive that it was used to move Stalin's gold through the heart of London. And today, this very empire still hides billions of dollars for Putin. And the financial machinery that makes all of this possible comes from the most unlikeliest of places. This is the story of how Russia's greatest enemies became their secret lifeline. It's the summer of 1941, and Nazi Germany just invaded Soviet Union with some 3 million men, over 3,000 tanks, and with 2,500 warplanes. This was called Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. And the Soviet Union was completely unprepared. You see, the Red Army collapsed under the speed and coordination of the attack. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured just within days. But here's the thing, Stalin had been warned about this earlier by his very own generals about the attack, but he ignored them. You see, he believed that Hitler wouldn't end up attacking him. But the attack actually happened, and Stalin froze. He retreated to his office and just stopped giving orders. It was dead silence. And for days afterwards, the Soviet leadership was paralyzed. The country had no clear direction, even though the enemy tanks were closing in every day. Now, the disaster with Stalin's leadership went even deeper. You see, 4 years earlier, Stalin had destroyed his own army from within. Stalin did something unspeakable during the Great Terror of 1937 and 38. Some call it the Great Purge, where countless civilians were slaughtered, along with arrests and execution of most of his top military officials. And the reason behind all of this was that Stalin was facing some real opposition from within the Communist Party, so he was paranoid about potential threats to his power. So, he used this as a justification to eliminate all perceived enemies, and that included party members, military leaders, and anyone who might challenge his absolute rule. Now, as a result of this Great Purge, over half of the army's senior leadership were wiped out. Command structures were hollow, and no one would dare to make any decisions. I mean, at this point, they feared Stalin more than they feared the Nazis. Now, despite this, the weakened Soviet military would still stop the German advances, and it would begin its own push for victory. I mean, they would end up winning the war, but at a very terrible price. The official economic figures that historians now agree on are kind of staggering. 1,700 cities and towns were destroyed, 70,000 villages were burned, over 25 million people were displaced, over 6 million buildings were reduced to rubble, more than 30,000 factories were gone, and over 100,000 schools, hospitals, and clinics were just lost. The damage was valued at over 700 billion rubles in 1941. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $3.8 trillion today. And yeah, the Nazi invasion and the Germans were to blame for a lot of this, but a lot of the blame also lied with Stalin. You see, as Soviet forces retreated, Stalin gave one simple order, and that was evacuate what you can, but burn the rest. The towns were set on fire by their very own defenders. Factories and bridges were blowing up, and entire regions were scorched just to slow down the Germans. But here's the thing, while his country burned, Stalin came out of it even stronger. I was saying, Stalin came out of this stronger than ever before after this devastation. You see, he used the chaos to tighten his grip and rebuild his empire on his terms. Under his new orders, the Soviet forces took everything from the countries that they now occupied. This included factories, rail cars, livestock, art, machinery, I mean, you name it. Entire industrial plants were dismantled in Eastern Europe and shipped back to the USSR. Now, at this time, Stalin also squeezed the West for his personal benefit. There was this US policy at the time, it was called Lend-Lease, where the United States would provide war materials. Things like weapons, food, and other supplies were given to allied nations without any request for immediate payments. So the Allies had poured in trucks, fuel, food, weapons, and materials all over to Stalin's regime to help him fight the Nazis, and he accepted all of it, you see. But after the war, he refused to return most of it. The total amount of the aid and the materials that was supplied to the Soviet economy was mind-boggling. According to several economists, Stalin racked over 2 trillion rubles, a sum far larger than the destruction that the war had inflicted. Now, if we adjust that for inflation, that may amount to nearly $11 trillion today. It's staggering. Now, with this surplus, Stalin quietly built one of the largest gold reserves in the world because he didn't stop there. After extracting all that he could from the West and from Eastern Europe, he then turned to his own prisoners that he had captured during the war. You see, the war prisoners were employed as forced labor in the mines, and they were used to extract gold. Now, as you can imagine, this was forced labor, and it didn't really cost that much to him, but the gold that was mined was substantial, and he used this to trade with the West. Now, sounds like Stalin had it all figured out, right? All that surplus, all that gold, it meant that he was building a fortune for his regime. But there was one problem. He couldn't admit that he was using what was essentially a capitalist trade system to build his wealth. So he had to find a way to hide his dependence on the West from his supporters. To make this work, he set up a financial shadow network. It began with 3 quiet, obscure banks in the West. And they were the Moscow Narodny Bank in London, the Eurobank in Paris, and the Bank Russo-Iran in Tehran. Now, on paper, they all looked like ordinary financial firms, but in reality, they helped Stalin move gold, buy technology, and park money abroad, all off the books. You see, the Kremlin had these secret accounts. They built shell companies. You see, publicly embracing capitalist finance was unacceptable. That's pretty obvious, right? But privately, they knew that it was essential to hold on to that power. And unshockingly, the Western banks just played along. They trusted the USSR because now it had gold, and a lot of it. The Soviet Union had the largest gold reserves outside of Fort Knox. In the eyes of Western financiers, it was basically a good bet. They were creditworthy, reliable, and worth the risk. Through this offshore system, Stalin bought what his country could not build. He imported Western machinery, he secured key materials, and he ensured that the regime could survive not just militarily, but financially, using financial systems that he publicly claimed to despise. Now, we talk quite a bit about Stalin and how he built his wealth during the Soviet era, right? But what about after his time? You see, he built a financial system that would keep his philosophy of money alive. And that philosophy was that it was all about presenting a communist-leaning ideology for the masses. But secretly, they had to amass wealth for the selected elites in society. So let's take a minute to talk about how that worked. You see, the Communist Party kept denouncing capitalism in its speeches and public forums, but behind closed doors, they just kept on investing. By 1975, the Soviet Union had quietly tripled its banking presence in the West. It had now operated 7 banks and 3 major branches across key global financial hubs. Moscow Narodny Bank and Eurobank that I mentioned earlier had become some of the largest financial institutions in London and Paris. These banks held over $6 billion in combined assets, and the real purpose was basically to transfer billions more from the USSR to the West and vice versa. These institutions helped the USSR and its allies to tap into Western money markets. By 1975, this network was helping raise billions of dollars in syndicated loans. Half of it went to the USSR and Eastern Europe, and the rest was funneled to Cuba and Yugoslavia, and all of it stayed out of public view. These banks weren't just money pipelines, they were profit centers, and they made steady returns for the Soviet leadership. They sold Soviet gold quietly, and they moved funds through shell companies. They shielded transactions with a level of secrecy that even Western banks found unusual. But let's remember something, right? All of this was happening during the Cold War. The West and Soviet governments were competing against each other, even though their banks were secretly cooperating. And that's why Soviet banks came to serve another pretty useful purpose, and that was intelligence gathering. Soviet banks became so embedded in trying to mirror and monitor Western institutions that they actually earned a reputation for efficiency and discretion. It's why they attracted deposits at prime rates, the same rates that Western giants received. Now, they provided the communist bloc with commercial insights. They provided information about global trade, patterns, pricing, and logistics. They also obtained credit profiles on Western companies, helping the Soviets spot who they could trust and whom they could pressure. Ironically, this trust that they built was so strong that some Western European governments even began offering a generous credit line to Soviet blocs. Now, the politics took a backseat to profit at this time, because Western governments saw this as a way to boost their own exports. What's even more surprising is that Western banks started investing inside the USSR itself. Now, while all of this was happening, Washington, D.C. was starting to get concerned. A declassified report by the CIA warned that the hard currency loans from the West that were processed through these Soviet banks were effectively funding the Soviet military buildup. By providing untied credit, which was essentially money with no restrictions, the West was paying for the weapons that basically aimed back at them. Now, you'd think that this financial system would end or evolve after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? But the Communist Party's wealth didn't just vanish overnight. I mean, it was simply rebranded. Much of it flowed to a new class of insiders, and they were called the oligarchs. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Remember how the Western banks had deep ties with the Kremlin's financial elites? Well, turns out they went a step further to actually help these elites. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, US policymakers, and economists from Wall Street all pushed for this bold plan. It was called shock therapy. Basically, it was an idea of rapidly unleashing market forces as a way to electrocute the old Soviet system and jolt Russia into embracing capitalism. Now, as a result, overnight, Russia was told to drop state controls, embrace privatization, and open its markets. But what followed was the largest handover of public assets to private hands that was ever recorded. In 1992, the Russian government launched its first wave of privatization. It handed out 148 million vouchers to citizens. Essentially, the concept was one per person, and these could be used to buy shares in formerly state-owned enterprises. I mean, in theory, it sounded pretty fair. It sounded like a good deal. But in practice, it was heavily in favor to the former Soviet banking class. Now, by the time privatization began, many future oligarchs had already owned banks, and they had the cash to buy up millions of these vouchers at very cheap prices. Ordinary Russians were desperate for food and medicine and basic life necessities, so they just sold their vouchers for scraps. In this way, the connected elites bought factories, mines, oil fields, and TV networks. Again, this was coordinated with Western banks and credit institutions. They basically moved funds and hid their wealth in offshore accounts. They opened the gates to global markets while the Russian economy burned and ordinary people suffered. Now, these newly minted oligarchs wanted more control, and they now eyed the remaining industries that were still in the government's hands. With their corrupt cronies in power, they hatched something darker, a second scheme, and this time they called it loans for shares. And the idea was simple. A group of ultra-wealthy insiders would loan the Yeltsin government billions of dollars. And just re-jog your memory, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin was the first president of what we know today as Russia. He took his seat in 1991. Anyway, in return, these wealthy individuals would receive temporary control of major state-owned companies, and these included oil, gas, metals, and more. Now, the government would inevitably default on these loans, and the oligarchs would end up keeping the assets. So what ended up happening is that in a matter of months, Russia's crown jewels, which were these giant oil firms, metal empires, banks, they were all sold for pennies on the dollar to insiders, many of whom had been members of the old Communist Party elites. To ordinary people, it looked like Russia was failing. It was a failing democracy, but in reality, the old guard was still in power, just under a different system, one that was more predatory and harder to dislodge. Now, around 1999, they faced a new problem because people were starting to grow restless. The economy was unstable, and Yeltsin's popularity had collapsed. So Yeltsin and his inner circle needed a clean exit to save face and let someone else take the heat in their stead. So they turned to this low-profile ex-KGB man from St. Petersburg, one who was known to be timid, loyal, quiet, easy to control. They believed that he would protect their wealth and their power, and this person was none other than Vladimir Putin. Little did they know that they were unleashing a monster that would quickly outgrow and consume them. Now, once he was in power, Putin wasted no time. He used his KGB links and the full weight of his state to consolidate control. He knew where the oligarchs had stashed their money. He knew who owed what and to whom, and he knew how to turn fear into leverage. Now, many of those who opposed him or challenged him ended up dead, exiled, or brought to heel. The old communist elites were finally purged for good, and in their place, Putin installed his own men, people that he trusted the most. He handpicked people who were loyal because they owed everything to him. By controlling the assets through his loyal oligarchs, he now controlled the system. And many of those assets, like the banks and the gold and the foreign investments, had been relics of the Soviet financial web. In other words, Putin didn't build his power base from scratch. He simply seized the keys to an existing system from the old guard and had them purged. Today, many claim that Putin's personal wealth goes as high as around $200 billion. He's rumored to have his own palaces, fleets of cars, private jets, and hidden companies, but his name is rarely on the paperwork. But despite this, his fortune keeps growing. He hides his wealth through multiple shell companies and various other financial means. You see, the way that the state today behaves under Putin has a lot of resemblance to how things operated under Stalin. The system is set up to reward loyalty to those in power. But more importantly, it's set up to purge threats and get rid of opposers through fear and power. And it protects its power not just through its secret police, but also through a shadow financial empire that lets it operate far beyond Russia's borders. Now, Putin doesn't run his state like a typical authoritarian. Instead, you could almost see him as the latest CEO in Stalin's secret capitalist empire. I mean, Putin's financial network is both his shield and his ultimate bargaining chip with the West. Because in the West, he knows that even elected leaders are answerable to the banking elite. You'll notice how this played out in 2022. Right after Russia invaded Ukraine, Western leaders promised a crackdown. Things like sanctions, asset freezes, economic warfare, all of that stuff, right? And granted, some of those financial policies really did hurt Russia, at least for a bit. But years later, we almost see that the money is basically still in place. I mean, large financial transactions still happen, Russia's currency still hasn't collapsed. In fact, most Western banks have struggled to leave Russia even though they wanted to. Some didn't even try, because Putin holds an immense leverage through his secret financial empire and his financial controls. You see, these Western crackdowns that Putin made essentially made it very difficult for foreign companies to exit the country even if they wanted to. He passed this bill that was aimed at disrupting sales and allowing deals to be hijacked by business people who were close to the Kremlin. So those who managed to exit only did so by complying with Putin and his cronies. You see, the sanctions didn't really hurt the Kremlin that much because those sanctions never effectively targeted their secret banking networks. If anything, all of this further tightened Putin's grip over the Russian economy. And the story doesn't really end there because today some Western banks are lobbying against EU proposals to use profits from frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine. I mean, they talk about the language of legal risk and market stability, but honestly, I think that the reason is far simpler. It's just that they're financially tied to Putin's empire. Look, we talk quite a bit about Stalin, Putin, and everything in between when it comes to Russia's billionaires to essentially make one overall point, and that is, the real power behind these strongmen was never really nukes, tanks, or even their communist ideologies. The real power behind them was how they thought about finance. Because when you're in control of money, you're in control of who gets to rule and who gets to eat. This is probably why US presidents never really go all out against anti-democratic strongmen, people like Putin, Mohammed bin Salman, or Xi Jinping. I mean, it just won't happen that easily because again, it basically all comes down to money.